Nowhere in the pages of history can one find a greater champion of justice. Return with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear.
And I'll tell you something else, too, is I cannot stand sissies.
You're going to talk about wrestling, that's redneck talk.
And guess what, fatso? I'm the world champion.
Hey everybody, this is Carl Stern here for the Dragon King Carl Classic Wrestling Audio Show, WrestlingObserver.com, Figure4Online.com, my website, WhenItWasCool.com. Thank you all very much for joining me this week. We're going back to our usual format of things for a week, although I've got some specials coming up for you. We're going to look at, again, this great spreadsheet, which was made by one of the readers at Wrestling Observer. A poster on the board by the handle of American Numbers has created this great spreadsheet. And today we're going to really look at somebody I have, maybe the wrestler I've seen the most in my life, Bob Armstrong, Bullet Bob Armstrong. He was my hometown star for most of his career, and he is not in the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame. He is in the WWE Hall of Fame, an organization he never wrestled for. What's that all about? Well, we'll talk about it much, much more. Last time when I talked on this program, I did not have full access to the spreadsheet. Somehow it managed to get weirdly formatted on my device, but for whatever reason, however that magic works, we're back again, and so I can see all the numbers that we need. I think we'll go into the second half of the show. We'll do some Madison Square Garden history. We skipped that last episode, and maybe if we have time, we'll do some more Tokyo Dome as well. But we got a lot to talk about when it comes to Bullet Bob Armstrong, because he is, one of my all-time favorites, and somebody certainly I grew up watching, met many times. When the little while, couple years span there in the 1990s when I did some wrestling, I never wrestled Bob Armstrong. I did wrestle Scott, and in fact got super kicked by Scott Armstrong, and but never wrestled Bob. Was on many shows he was at, and liked Bob Armstrong. He passed away a few years ago. He and his wife had been, really, honestly, it was kind of as portrayed on TV. Bob was this family man. He had several sons who got involved in wrestling. He had been married to his wife for many years. Goodness, I think they were up to maybe their 60th anniversary or somewhere right in there before both passed away. And like we see many times with older people who've been together a long time, they passed away within short time of one another. And his sons, Brad, who died before Bob did, was a great wrestler, generally considered amongst wrestlers as somebody you really wanted to be in the ring with. Now, he never achieved the level of fame I think a lot of people hoped he would, but in the ring, there was no questioning Brad Armstrong. He was excellent. He was, to me, honestly, with the right coaching, and had Brad ever gotten the right environment to stoke his growth, I'm not saying he could have been Randy Savage, but they are very similar athletically. If you just watch a really good Brad Armstrong match, watch a really good Randy Savage match, you can see they're cut from the same cloth athletically. Now, Randy Savage was very famous, some would say infamous, for needing to script out or wanting to script out every single movement in the match, down to even sometimes some of the most mundane things. There wasn't a lot of spontaneity for Randy Savage work. Whereas Brad, so far as I knew, for most any match I ever saw with Brad, was there, working for a promotion where Brad worked or whatever. He was very, call it on the spot. He was very much call it in the ring kind of guy, very smooth, very fluid. Everything he did looked had great sharpness. But besides that, he also had Scott Armstrong, Steve Armstrong, who I think, may have been the guy with the most upward potential of all of them. And you wouldn't necessarily think that, as good as Brad was. Scott was viewed like Scott had he was deceptively bigger. Like you look at Scott, you think junior heavyweight, U.S. junior heavyweight championship, but Scott was bigger than people realize. He was tall, and even though he had like a basketball player's build, he was kind of slight. He wasn't small. I mean, Scott was a good sized guy, but he gave that unfortunate visual perception of him being smaller. Steve was the stronger one of all of them. I'm guessing. I don't know if in Bob's prime, if he was in Bob's league as far as weightlifting goes, but I think he wasn't far off. He's certainly a very strong guy, powerful guy. And while he didn't have that fluidity that Brad had, he was a very solid, good worker. I mean, he was he and Tracy Smothers, of course, were a tag team for a long time. They were very similar in a lot of respects, and I think Steve was quite good. And then, of course, there's Brian Road Dogg, who did go on to become very successful. And I hope I'm not leaving any of them out. But Bob's family was very well known in the southern United States, and some even more so. I mean, Steve Armstrong had a short stint in WWF as not an enhancement wrestler, but like one step above that. He wrestled under the unfortunate name of Leif Cassidy. Was he Leif Cassidy? Who was Steve? After I said that, I thought, that might not be right. Let me do a double check on Steve Armstrong's, because it was such a fleeting time, and that's been so long ago. Off the top of my head, don't remember Steve Armstrong's WWF name, but it was dumb. It wasn't Steve Armstrong anyway. But Bob was such a great, like, hometown babyface. I mean, he had that kind of southern hospitality sort of, fight for the family, the Marine, the fireman, that whole deal. And it worked for him, whereas other people, I think it would have been a significant that would have been a hard gimmick to pull off. I am literally a good guy. So, Lance Cassidy, by the way, was Steve Armstrong's WWF. Like, who could be expected to remember that, right? Lance Cassidy. So, Bob Armstrong in the Observer Hall of Fame. Well, what do I think? Somebody who knows so much about Bob Armstrong, big Bob Armstrong fan and so forth. I said this, I was on Hannibal TV this past weekend, by the way. If you want to see the video of that, you can go to my website when it was cool, and I've got a link there. Plus, obviously, you can go to Hannibal TV. And I talked about this a little bit there. That even though, if there is a Alabama, Georgia, Southern States Wrestling Hall of Fame, I mean, Bob Armstrong's one of your top guys, right? He's one of the no-brainers to go in. Nationally, Bob didn't work that many different places. He was a world title contender, yes, in Southeastern and Continental. He was, you could even say, and may have even gotten world title shots in Memphis when he worked up there. Georgia, he was a major player over there as well, certainly worked, all the world champions from the era you could think of, Jack Briscoe, Hardy Race, certainly Ric Flair many times. I mean, Ric Flair was his main, high-level adversary for Southeastern and Continental Wrestling. Bob also is, I guess, one unfortunate thing about his career was he came along a little too early, I think. Like Bob, by the time the late 70s, 1980s rolled around, where wrestling was booming, he was already well in his 40s. He was already had a lot of miles on him, so to speak, and worked a slower style and not as when you're sitting there watching Brad Armstrong on the same TV show as Bob Armstrong, there's a very visible athletic difference. I mean, Bob is one of those guys who kind of looked a lot older than he was over the years. Like he just, you could look and tell this was a man with some years on him. He was always in great shape. But the times had changed. Bob fit very well as a wrestler in the 70s. But by the 1980s, when you have things like the Rock and Roll Express, the Midnight Express, the Midnight Rockers, you have all these fast teams. The motion has picked up, and for tough guys like Bob, you had the bigger monsters. They had come along and kind of took that place. So Bob was, in a way, unfortunately, kind of like a dinosaur. I mean, his time, he was kind of out of sync with when he would have been the best, got the most visibility. And he, as in Southeastern Wrestling, which is my personal favorite, all-time nostalgic promotion to look at, to study, I grew up with on our When It Was Cool podcasting network. We have a very honored to have Aaron Gartland, who does a show called Southeastern Championship Wrestling Action News, where he goes through that whole Pensacola area by the show to show. And that's my favorite thing. And Bob was, the top star. He and Ron Fuller back and forth over that. By the time it came around to Continental Wrestling and more people saw Continental Wrestling as cable TV expanded and so forth, and the promotion did very well and exposed grew geographically as well. Bob had put the mask on as the Bullet. And even though after he became the Bullet, and I believe the Bullet debut was 86, is that right? 1986. After that, he never wrestled again in Alabama without the Bullet mask. Now, there may have been, at the very, very, very end of Bob's, independent career, a few years before he died, he may have started making some appearances there. But mostly, by and large, anytime I would say probably 99%, if it's not 100%, in Alabama, Bob never wrestled as anybody other than the Bullet again. And so that, I think, actually hurts his case in that I think many people consider Bob Armstrong and the Bullet character separately from one another, because the Bullet, you've heard all the stories. Oh, he was getting older. His face had been somewhat disfigured, although not really. He didn't look that much different than he did earlier on after the weightlifting accident, although he was said to have been somewhat self-conscious about his post-accident way his face looked. I never saw it myself, but you understand something that could work on somebody whose career is in television. And so he started wearing the mask. And I do think that hurts his Hall of Fame case, although I still, at best case scenario, I still do not see a national case or international case for Bob Armstrong, not in this type of Hall of Fame. And I know this hurts some people's feelings, but I've just got to be honest. I can't just vote for a person because they were one of my favorite wrestlers. There's, I think, a little bit too much of that goes on anyway, where it's like, I want everybody to see in this guy or whatever what I see in them, and they overinflate the case. And I don't think that's necessary with Bob, because I do think Bob is historically underrated and underappreciated. And I say that not that you're going to put on a 1988 Bullet match and think, what's all this fuss about, Carl? No, his time was much before that. But I do think he is underappreciated, and I think he's more important than he's ever given credit for. I think people I know I can evidentiary, I can point you to many cases where it's as though Southeastern Championship Wrestling and Continental never existed. And that was where the bulk of his success and his creativity went. Dave Meltzer seldom ever covered, not to any degree, Southeastern Wrestling or Continental. Was given a few words here and there, but it was considered by many people in the business as a, quote, small promotion, even though it was as successful or more successful than some of the ones that were regularly reported on. They kept to themselves. They were very tight-knit group. Ron Fuller kept kayfabe, still sometimes keeps kayfabe. He's didn't let the magazines in to cover Southeastern Continental. He certainly didn't want anything leaked to the newsletters. I don't know if Ron Fuller ever read an issue of the Observer or even knows what it is, probably. Doesn't seem like his thing. Bob probably did know. Certainly his kids knew. In fact, I know his kids knew because saw them with an Observer saw Steve with an Observer one time. But Bob, I just, I would love to sit here and just tell you how underappreciated Bob is, and he is. But I would suggest listen to Aaron's show for the day-by-day teleplay of the history of Southeastern, later Continental wrestling, because that's where the real good stuff is. And you read any sort of biography of Bob Armstrong, even Dave's obituary in the Observer when he passed away. There's little to no mention of the main thing he put his life and career into, Southeastern Wrestling Continental. It's always mentioned Georgia. And yeah, Georgia, he was a significant star there, certainly for a period of time, and especially because that got, WTBS coverage. The him choosing a side in the Georgia War certainly gets talked about, as well as it should. Even mention a little bit of his stuff in Memphis. And in Jim Crockett promotion, where he never really did anything of note in Crockett promotions. I mean, he was there as the older, father of Brad Armstrong, was about the extent of Bob's character for Jim Crockett promotion. So what do you do with it? I can't make a Hall of Fame case for that. As much as I like Bob, as much as I'm glad I grew up watching Bob Armstrong, I think very highly of him, but there's just, for an International Hall of Fame, there's just not the statistics there to merit it. Now, you got to get 60% to get into the Hall of Fame. Okay, so that's a good standard, I think. Bob's, the most he's ever gotten was 29%. That was his all-time high. And that's not even half what he needs to get in the Hall of Fame. The last time we voted on Hall of Fame, he was down to 17%. So 10%, under 10%, you're off the ballot. I just don't see any chance Bob Armstrong gets into the Hall of Fame. He's going to be one of those people. With 17%, I don't see him dropping below, 10% either. It's possible, I suppose. But I think Bob's going to be one of those people, kind of like a Cowboy Bob Ellis. I don't even know if I'm going to talk about Bob Ellis next time or not, because honestly, his case is similar, I think, to Bob Armstrong, just maybe a little bit earlier chronologically speaking. But he's going to be one of those people like Bob Ellis who sits on the ballot, maybe a full 15 years before, he finally falls off, because that's, he never got voted enough to stay in. Can't do it. Sorry, Bob. Love Bob Armstrong. And again, thank you, American Numbers, for your chart and information. As always, I am open to different opinions and different thoughts on the matter. I know Aaron Gartland of Southeastern Championship Wrestling Action, he kind of scolded me last time. He's like, "I'm going to work on you about Bob Armstrong," and I'm, and you should do that. I'm all for somebody making a case and putting down on paper. But what I need is more than, I really like this guy, he really spoke to me as a wrestler. That's not Hall of Fame criteria. Hall of Fame criteria, well, maybe it is for WWE, and he's in that Hall of Fame, which is weird because he never worked for WWE. His, the whole deal behind that was, it was a favor to son Brian, Road Dogg, and it also was at a time where they were interested in such things, how times change, in obtaining video library licenses. The Southeastern Continental tapes are in a weird limbo, sort of like Memphis. I don't know that legally, and I'm not an attorney. Aaron Gartland is. Maybe you can ask him. I'm not an attorney. But I've never saw, like with Memphis tapes, because it was so many people were claiming to have rights to that or selling rights. I mean, it was Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett originally, and you would think, well, they'd own it. But no, they sold the company to the Larry Burton, I believe was his name. And, so that should have passed along to him there probably, but then he folded or bankrupted or whatever happened or sold it to somebody else. Corey Macklin at one time before he died was claiming to hold some rights to the library and selling it as such. I honestly, and look, those tapes are all over YouTube. I don't think legally there's anything that could, keep somebody from putting those up on their YouTube channel and enjoying it. They seem very public domain-ish, but again, I'm not a lawyer, not telling you to do this by any stretch, but the Southeastern Continental tapes kind of fall in the same way. It seems like any claimed ownership of those was gone a long time ago. David Woods bought the company. Did he also get the rights to the tapes and whatever? Who knows? Maybe, maybe not. David Woods, the company eventually went out of business under him, and in fact, he formally and legally closed the company. I think it was all the way up to 1993 or 94 before he did that. And then what happened to those intellectual property? Well, Ron Fuller's kind of reclaimed this, and I think rightfully so. I don't know that legally he can enforce any kind of, showdown again. Not an attorney, not trying to be one. Consult one before accepting this as correct information. But he's doing something with streaming now for his Studcast podcast, where he's doing a channel that's putting old footage up on there. We have Southeastern up on our When It Was Cool YouTube channel, as does many, many, many other people. So I think WWF was trying to maybe legitimize some sort of stake, especially maybe not even for the Southeastern Continental, but for some of the Georgia stuff. Perhaps there was it certainly was a olive branch, because why else is Bob Armstrong going into the WWE Hall of Fame? Makes no sense at all. But he did. He went in when they were in Atlanta. And again, oftentimes, at least back several years ago, I don't know if they still do this or not, but they used to, whenever they came to a new town or a big city, if that city was part of a big territory back in the era, they would try to induct one or two people from that territory. And because it was in Atlanta, WrestleMania that year, Bob was inducted in. And yeah, I have no problem with that at all. But again, speaking of the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, I just don't see it there. All right, let's take our mid-show break. When we come back, let's go to the Madison Square Garden and try to get some Tokyo Dome into. I'd like to get both of those in on this episode if we could. So we'll be right back after this. Hey everybody, this is Carl here. No pre-cut advertisement for this episode because I wanted to speak personally and directly to you at this time. We are in a major drive right now at whenitwascool.com, my website. Our website archives over 2,500, rapidly approaching 3,000 podcasts on pro wrestling history, pop culture, retro pop culture, and much, much more. We need to obtain a certain level of Patreon growth for us to launch the next stage of our website, which is going to be video. And I have much of the equipment I need. In fact, some more just came in today. But there's still significant upgrades that I have to do in order to start. Now, this podcast won't be going anywhere. The podcast will remain so long as I am healthy and able to do it. But I really want to add video to our channel to bring When It Was Cool up to a bigger level, get more monetization opportunities out of it, and to be able to, most importantly, show and tell different pieces of wrestling memorabilia, things we can talk about and look at that's going to expand to magazines and newsletters and action figures and all the stuff I really want to do with When It Was Cool. But in order to do that, we need about a 10 to 12% growth of where we are currently on Patreon. We have a very active Patreon community, a very good troll-free Patreon community with lots of good discussion. Would love for you to come be a part of that. Our introductory level is just $5 a month. Yes, you heard me right, $5 a month. Try to take a $5 bill in McDonald's today, see what that gets you. Well, it'll get you instant access to over 5,000, 5,000, about 2,500 or so, up to 3,000 soon, podcasts on our network. And not only that, PDF copies of my books, my omnibus books, including the recent Pioneer Era Wrestling Omnibus, all that included in there. So if I could get anybody that's ever thought about it, coming over for 1 month, just give us a try. You can cancel it any time. I think it would really give us a good momentum of growth, especially coming off the success, and very successful, has been the Dragon King Carl Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus. So we're building some momentum right now, but we need a good little boost. So from now until about mid-April, we're putting everything we can into boosting our Patreon membership. And I personally want to implore you today, if you've never checked us out before, you don't have to look us up on Patreon, do nothing like that. Just go to the URL, whenitwascool.com, and there you'll see us. Plenty of links, plenty of free stuff too. Check us out, whenitwascool.com. Now, back to the show. All right, so let's go back to, I know this 1930s Madison Square Garden stuff may not be everybody's cup of tea, so I'm trying to, until we get to a more modern era, chop this down a little more digestible. So we're not going to spend a real long time in it, but let's go to a couple of shows from 1934. We're going to start with April 30th, 1934, with an attendance of 3,000 people. Now remember, this is the time period where everybody in the world, they want to watch Jim Londos wrestle. And Jim Londos, by the common person on the street, is probably who they think of when they think of world champion. But there's been much going on in New York, particularly surrounding Madison Square Garden. There has been a big scandal with Jack Pfeffer. In fact, they even had hearings on the matter where he said, look, wrestling's fake. Went to the newspapers, told them that, went to the commission. And ultimately, the commission didn't care. And they moved, and life moved on. Jim Browning is the champion at this time, the world champion. And many of you just said, who? And yeah, people in 1934, similar thing. Everybody wanted to see Jim Londos. That's the real world champion, I think, in most people's mind. So let's see where this goes. April 30th, 1934, attendance 3,000. Your world champion, Jim Browning, beat Ray Steele in 36 minutes. Now, here's two special attraction wrestlers. Think of these as like your Andre the Giants or Ultimate Warriors back in the day. These were big-name entertainer type wrestlers. Gus Sonnenberg beat Man Mountain Dean in 3 minutes. That's why I had a short match there. You didn't want those two going very long. Joe Savoldi beat George Hagen. Willie Davis went to a draw with Harry Fields. Hans Kampfer went to a draw with Rudy Dusick. Marshall Blackstock beat Doug Wyckoff. Abe Coleman beat Bert Ruby. Then the next month, or actually just about a week later, May 7th, 1934, 1,000 more people in attendance. Why, you say? Because Jim Londos is on the show. Jim Londos defeats Joe Savoldi by count out in 47 minutes. And remember, Joe Savoldi had just recently had a claim to the world championship himself in a double cross. So here, Jim Londos, there's the official on paper. Jim Londos is, above the pecking order of Joe Savoldi. Henry DeGlane, remember the famous world champion wrestler who may have won the title with a bite, a disqualification where it was alleged he bit Strangler Lewis on the leg and was disqualified and got the world championship for it. Well, he's at Madison Square Garden. Henry DeGlane went to a draw with Jim McMillan. Gus Sonnenberg beat Willie Davis. Hans Kampfer beat Maze McLean. Rudy Dusick beat Bull Comer. And Abe Coleman beat Ted Christie by DQ. Wire service report from June 25th, 1934 says only one will remain. The heavyweight wrestling throne, which usually has 2 or 3, sometimes half a dozen occupants, will have just one after Jim Londos, the Greek Hercules, and Jim Browning, Missouri pig farmer, come to grips tonight. The match, admitted by both sides to be for the heavyweight title, is expected to draw 30,000 people with a gate estimated at $100,000. So how'd they do? Well, not that. They took in less than half what they expected, $40,000. The attendance was 10,000 less than they expected, so $20,000. And again, this was not just this big main event. It was also a fundraiser for the Hearst Milk Fund, which always drew very well. Madison Square Garden, 20,000 people, a gate of 40,000. World Heavyweight Title Unification Match. Jim Londos, recognized in some areas, especially by the National Wrestling Association, beats the New York champion, Jim Browning. And Jim Browning was recognized by the New York State Athletic Commission. Just over an hour, 1 hour, 10 minutes, 10 seconds. Jim Londos is now back as the largely nationally recognized World Heavyweight Wrestling Champion. Ernie Dusick beat Carl Sarpolis. Sandor Szabo went to a draw with Joe Savoldi in 30 minutes. Everett Marshall beat Abe Coleman. Hans Kampfer went to a draw with George Zaharis. And Dick Schickott went to a draw with Yusuf Mamalt Jr. And this is what the paper had to say, and then we'll move on from here. We'll conclude our Madison Square Garden. Exciting look at the 1930s, Madison. Look, I'm not even going to try to pretend this was awesome stuff back then. I guess if you're a Jim Londos, aficionado, certainly it is, and I'm not to make a lot of that. Jim Londos was one of the biggest stars in the history of wrestling. Some would make an argument with some evidence that he may have been the biggest star in wrestling history. It's a matter of debate. But world mat title captured by Jim Londos. In an article written by James P. Dawson, Jim Londos gained undisputed possession of the World Heavyweight Catch-as-Catch-Can Wrestling title last night in the huge Madison Square Garden Bowl before 20,000. But they wish it had been 200,000. 20,000 spectators. One of the largest crowds ever to witness a local mat struggle. The sturdy, handsome Greek pinned the shoulders of the sad-faced Jim Browning, giant Missourian, defender of the title, in 1 hour, 10 minutes, 10 seconds of a struggle billed to a finish, one fall to decide, with the State Athletic Commission's official approval as a, quote, match. So this one was supposed to be real. It probably wasn't. The commission has drawn a distinction between matches and exhibitions, having refused to recognize any affair in wrestling as a match unless a title was being defended against a bona fide challenger. There are other claimants to the crown in different sections of the country. John Piesick is one. Henry DeGlane and Ed Don George are others. But in New York and the American Wrestling Centers governed by the commissions cooperating with the Empire State authorities, Londos will be the undisputed title holder until he is defeated or again ignores challenges and has the recognition withdrawn. The crowd of about 20,000 fans paid receipts estimated at $40,000 for the match, and a part of this goes to charity. The Free Milk Fund for Babies Incorporated, of which Mrs. William Randolph Hearst is chairman, will get 10% of the gross receipts to be expended in supplying milk for the children of New York's needy poor. Excuse me. In the gathering, which only partly filled the huge bowl on the Long Island flatlands, were men and women who are prominent in the life of the city and state. Typical of the sport, the struggle drew fans from many walks of life and other fields of sports. Jack Dempsey and Benny Leonard, two former boxing champions, were there. Edward P. Mulroney, chairman of the New York State Alcohol Beverage Control Board, and Herbert Bayard Swope were conspicuous at ringside, among others. In winning the title, Londos came again into possession of laurels he first held 4 years ago when he conquered Dick Schickott in an elimination tournament. Browning, on the other hand, became the fifth sport champion to be dethroned in the ring of the bowl. The others were in boxing, and in the order of their dethronement were Max Schmeling and Jack Sharkey, heavyweight champions, Jimmy McLaren, welterweight king, and Primo Carnera, who within the past fortnight lost his heavyweight championship under the driving fist of Max Baer. That's from the New York Times, Tuesday, June 26, 1934. So we will cease our look at Madison Square Garden wrestling for this week and come back on our next show. We'll pick up in October of that year, where Jim Londos is again conspicuous by his absence, and so we'll find out more about that. Now for something different. Let's go over to our Eggshells book, The History of Wrestling at the Tokyo Dome in Tokyo, Japan. And on our last episode, we were in 1994 doing a big show over there that had Hulk Hogan. This time, we go to All Japan Women, the AJW Female Dream Battle, Big Egg Wrestling Universe, November 20th, 1994. Attendance 42,500. Hugely successful for a women's show. And there were also some little people wrestlers on the show as well. But let's go through the results real quick. So your results for this show are going to be Bomber Hikari and Chaparita Asari defeated Hiromi Shugo and Hiromi Yaga. Great Little Muda, which is a wonderful wrestling name, I presume this was a little person, teamed up with Buddha Jinjin to defeat Tomizo Sunokake. And don't know these people. Again, you know my stance. Don't care one lick about women's wrestling. Never paid any attention to it, even back then. The AJW Junior Championship, Candy Otsu defeated Ri Tamada. Suzuka Manami defeated Karu. In a mixed martial arts match, that's interesting, Kumiko Maakawa defeated Shugar Miyake. In an amateur wrestling match, Doris Blind defeated Hiyoko Hamaguchi. Wonder that must be Animal Hamaguchi's daughter there in that match. In another amateur wrestling match, we had Miyu Yamamoto defeating Anna Gomez. Wrestling versus boxing, Fumihiko Ishimoto defeated Karu Ito. Chigusa Nagoya defeated Reggie Bennett. Mikako Futagami and Shinobu Kandori defeated Tomoko Watanabe and Toshio Yamada. The UWA belts from Mexico are here, the UWA Women's Tag Team Championship. Etsuko Mida and Mimi Shimoda defeated Michiko Nagashima and Yasha Kuranai. Bison Komura and Jaguar Yokota defeated Linus Asuka and Yumi Ogura. Blizzard Yuki defeated Mariko Yoshida. In what's called the V-Top tournament, Combat Toyota defeated Yumiko Hara. Also in this V-Top tournament, Akira Hokuto defeated Eagle Sawa. Aja Kong defeated Manami Toyota, also in a tournament match. Dynamite Kansei defeated Kyoko Inoue, also in a tournament match. Get a tag team match up next as Hikara Fukuoka and Megumi Kudo defeated Cutie Suzuki and Takako Inoue. Then there's a men's match on this show. Great Suzuki, Sato, and Shiru defeated Grand Nanawa. Jinshi Shinzaki, which of course was Hakushi in the WWF, and their partner Super Delphin. More from this V-Top tournament. Akira Hokuto defeated Combat Toyota. Aja Kong defeated Dynamite Kansai. The WWF Women's Championship was on the line as Bull Nakano defeated Alundra Blaze. And then finally the V-Top tournament final, Akira Hokuto defeated Aja Kong. And what Chris Charlton had to say in his book said, we had by now seen wrestling shows at the Tokyo Dome for over 5 years, a drop in the bucket when it came to New Japan's history, which along with All Japan had turned 22 by the end of 1994. Both promotions now outliving the JWA that birthed them. Both companies were fresh-faced when it was compared to All Japan Women. AJW was formed in 1968, though by then women's pro wrestling in Japan was no new phenomenon. In fact, its history is close in length to its male counterpart. Riki Dozan and Masahiko Komura wrestled Ben and Mike Sharp at the Sumo Hall February 1954 in what would be called Japan's first modern pro wrestling match. Just 9 months later, you had the first women's wrestling match there. So the length of time is pretty much the same. So I know there are a lot of huge fans of Joshi wrestling, and I'm not one of them, but good for all of you who are. Apparently some incredible matches were held in that promotion, and for those who are interested in such things, good for you. Wonderful stuff, I suppose. The next show we'll talk about. Oh, here is actually this is too much to pass up right here. In the book by Chris Charlton, Kenny Omega gives his thoughts about the Joshi scene there. He said, when I'd lost faith in wrestling, it was these type of Joshi matches that made me feel excitement for the sport again. Why couldn't the men replicate that passion? It wasn't until mid-2016 I think I was able to allow myself to empty my heart and soul into a match like Toyota and Kong did, and use that in conjunction with my ability to do what I've been doing. So there, if you're a fan of a guy, goodness gracious, he's probably had more, 4-star and north matches than maybe anybody in history. Is he beat Misawa in that record yet? If not, he's got to be close up there, and that's what inspired him. So that's saying something pretty major there. I would think that one of the best wrestlers, if not the best wrestler of this era, at least the era up to this one. Kenny Omega, I know he's still a champion, still in AEW and all this, but come on, he peaked a few years ago, pretty much, seems to me like. Not an expert on modern wrestling, by the way, but seems like he had a peak a few years ago. But that whole era, packed full of big matches, big stars, was influenced by this, and that's great. So we'll pick up on the next episode, January 4th, 1995, back with New Japan, where going to be some big matches on this show, and Shinya Hashimoto's in as IWGP champion, and I loved me some Shinya Hashimoto matches for sure. So we're going to wrap it up here for this week on the Dragon King Carl Classic Wrestling Audio Show. And I want to extend, again, an invitation. Come over and check us out over at When It Was Cool. We've got some big things going on. If you only listen to pro wrestling podcasts, we've got a couple over at our website, besides the ones I do, which are 1,000 Hours, of course, the Pioneer Era Wrestling Podcast, and this show, the traditional Tuesday Dragon King Carl Classic Wrestling Show. We also have Aaron Gartland's Southeastern Championship Wrestling Action News, and also Eric Darcy's Wrestling with the Dog, which also covers matches from a historical perspective, although Eric usually covers more later time period than I do, usually 1990s and 2000s, which is great. Gives us a variety of stuff over at When It Was Cool. And we got to really blow that Patreon up this in the next month or so, because I want to get on the video journey. I'm working on our studio right now. In fact, you got a glimpse of some of the early stages of it when I was on Hannibal TV this past weekend, and but I've only got that one side done, the camera side, but working on some of the other stuff. But before I can commit to that, we've got to raise some capital to do that. I'm hoping to do that through our Patreon. And thank you all for listening. Thank you all who have supported me for so many years. Thank you to everybody who has bought a copy of my most recent book, Dragon King Carl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus. And thank you to everyone who continues to support this show. And I'll see you back here next week with some great classic pro wrestling action. Hey everybody, this is Carl Stern from WhenItWasCool.com. I'm here to tell you about my new book, now available, Dragon King Carl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus, the Bible of the Pioneer Era of professional wrestling. Pro wrestling didn't start with Frank Gotch. He didn't just appear out of the void to bring us entertainment-style professional wrestling. No, it was built on a legacy some 70 to 80 years old. That's what I'm going to talk to you about, an era of wrestling in America seldom ever discussed, never before in this detail. I have put 700 pages of information about the pioneers of professional wrestling, like William Muldoon, Colonel James H. McLaughlin, Professor Theobald Bauer, Clarence Whistler, William Miller, and so many more. Maybe some names you've never heard of before, maybe some you've only heard in passing. I will tell you the origins and evolution. Now available, Amazon.com, WhenItWasCool.com. Here's a soundbite from the Dragon King Carl Classic Wrestling Podcast from WhenItWasCool.com. We get the Patriots. We've already talked about Firebreaker Chip, Todd Champion. Now, now, mind you, remember, I said these are all essentially male strippers. Van Hammer, the guitar guy. How did somebody not name the Army guy Dale? How was he not Dale Champion? So you could have had Chippendales. I mean, have I got to go back in time and book 1992 WCW just so we can have the tag team of Chip and Dale? You can get more from this podcast and many others by going to whenitwascool.com. And remember, support us on Patreon.
We depend on Patreon support for our website and podcast network. In order to continue these podcasts you enjoy, we need you to visit whenitwascool.com and pledge at least $1. You'll gain access to lots of exclusive podcasts, newsletters, and more. Sign up is quick, simple, and can be canceled at any time. whenitwascool.com and click any Patreon link. Thank you.